Good morning and welcome to the Topological Data Analysis and Beyond workshop. We're streaming live now from different cities on the earth. This is a workshop that is jointly organized with a lot of people, namely Frédéric Chazal from Ariane in France, Smita
Good morning
Krishnaswamy
and
from
welcome
Yale
to the
University,
Topological Data
Roland Quitt from
Analysis
University of
and Beyond
Salzburg,
workshop. We're
and
streaming
Kati
live
from
now
IBM Research,
from different
Mihail Meda from
cities
Fujitsu
on the earth.
Laboratories, and Guy
This is
Wolf
a
from
workshop that is jointly
Université de
organized
Montréal
with a lot of
and
people.
Milan. And we're going to keep it brief and just give you a brief introduction into the workshop and what you will see. So here's the overview of what is going to happen today. Most of this will not happen live, but will be live streamed so that you can listen to it on the conference website. We have one keynote lined up in the morning, then a lot of invited talks discussing numerous subjects on TDA and beyond. Then we have a poster session, which will happen in GatherTown, but more about that in a second. And our first live discussion. In this live discussion, we will have a selected number of panelists depending on their availability and time zones and whether they are already awake or not. And they will be available for general Q&A. So ask them whatever you want in one of the channels that we have set up. More about this also later. And they will also be available for general questions. So if you don't ask any questions, then we certainly will. After that, we have another keynote lined up, followed by more invited talks on various subjects. And this is again followed by another poster session in GatherTown, in which you will be able to ask questions to the presenters. Again, please do check the schedule on the website there to see who will be available, because as you can imagine now, having been to NEURLIPS for almost a week, people are coming from different time zones. No one is allowed to really travel anymore. So not all the poster presenters are available all the time. It's also possible, feel free to use the GatherTown during any of the other slots as well. We won't shut it down or anything. It's just that we guarantee that some presenters will be available during the poster session, and we cannot guarantee this for the other sessions. But they might stick around. They might talk. The poster session during the NEURLIPS week also often went on longer for than was than anticipated in the schedule. Again, after that, we'll have another live discussion with a selected set of participants. And then we go back to a similar program where we have some more invited talks, another poster session for those that are in a very different time zone. And this is followed by the last discussion, which will be live, and some closing remarks for this workshop. And make sure that you check all the times. You can see that we give the times in Central European time and also in Eastern Standard Time. So this is make sure that everything will happen the way you expect it to happen, in particular live talks. For the other talks, it's not so important. You can either see them in the live stream or you can click on them in the schedule, either on the virtual NEURLIPS website or on the outside facing website, whatever you prefer. All right. Again, just to reiterate, all these poster sessions will take place in GatherTown. So the Zoom link here and the live stream will not work. You will be shown a break sign, because that counts as a break for the operators here. And please note that those sessions only happen in GatherTown. It is possible that authors will ask you back on the Zoom if the poster is too crowded, but to be honest, it never happened to me during this week, so we can hope that it also doesn't happen today, but there's this option. All right, now let's briefly discuss some workshop statistics. Some of you have been waiting for this. So we got a lot of neat submissions. We got 53 submitted papers. We were able to accept 39 of them, namely 29 as posters, which means that they will happen in GatherTown and that the authors will discuss Q&A and everything, and 10 spotlights, which we accepted for small 3-minute presentations, and those will be streamed prior to the poster sessions. And also, if you take a look at the right-hand side and this nice donut here, this is kind of the topic visualization that is happening in this workshop today. Obviously, you would expect that there's a lot of persistence going on, but what I found surprising is that that graph is much more prevalent and much more relevant than I thought. And I previously thought about removing the word section there, but then it turned out that there are actually people doing a lot of sheath theory in which section has a meaning, and so I left it in, but probably it gets pumped up a little bit there as well. But you can see we have quite a diverse set of talks and papers outlined. There's a little bit of classification going on. There's a lot of model analysis going on, and a lot of data analysis, obviously, but there's also more, let's say, future-oriented papers that discuss things like how to employ sheaves in topological data analysis. So just some more brief words on how this sort of process worked. We had recruited more than 50 reviewers at one time, and on average everyone reviewed at least 2 papers. There were also a few heroic individuals that reviewed 3 or even more. There were also a lot of, well, not a lot of, but some emergency reviewers that jumped in because some people were unable to do the reviews for personal reasons. I mean, there's still outside, there's still this pandemic going on. If you if you care to look out of the window. And so we're really, really grateful for their help and their understanding and for their willingness to make this workshop a success, because we all know that everyone, it needs some time to do reviewing. You don't get this really quickly done if you want to do it right. And so we're really, really grateful for the support and the help here. If we would be meeting live, we would probably be distributing cookies or something like that. We'll have to think about some other way to show our gratitude to those people. So it really, as the saying goes, it really takes a small village to make all of these sort of things happen, and we're really happy about this. So last, before we go to the important links, let me just reiterate this. So everything in this schedule that you saw will be streamed, except for the poster sessions, for which you have to go to GatherTown, and the discussions for which you can watch the live stream and ask questions on the Rocket Chat or on the Slack. There's also 2 special sessions that I want to point out. So there are 2 demos given by people who did software packages. There's a Giotto TDA demo happening in the afternoon. I'll update the schedule momentarily because they wanted to make sure that that every author is okay with this. And there is a teaspoon demo also happening in the afternoon, which is already in the schedule. So the authors will be available live also in GatherTown, and they will show you some of the things that you can do with these packages. So if you ever wanted to use some of the software packages that are around for TDA, this is an excellent time to ask that. I also want to point out that we have a special talk by Lida Canary, which will be live, and this will happen after the lunch break. So please do be, if you want to watch this, you cannot watch this pre-recorded, you have to go to the live stream for this. I also want to reiterate this. We have now been through a week of the conference, and we've seen how it all works. Really, don't be shy. Ask your questions. We will not mention your name anyway when you ask the panel questions. So there's no need to feel embarrassed or anything. You can ask the panelists anything. So it can be about their paper, obviously, their talk. It can also be about a more generic question that you always wanted to know. It can be a future question. You can also direct questions to all the panelists, and they will all answer them one after the other. So make this a success. Ask people questions. Don't be shy. Don't hold back. And there's multiple ways of doing these Q&As. So we have the Rocket Chat on the platform website. We also have the Slack, and we'll make sure that we can sort of use both of them. So that brings me to the last slide with the important links and resources and some shortened links so that you can actually use them. I'll also put the slides on the official website, on the external website now, which is the one that is mentioned in the NEURLIPS email. So we have a workshop webpage, both an external facing one, which we're hosting on GitHub. This has almost the same information as the internal facing one. The only difference is that the internal facing one also has direct links to the videos and things like this. But other than that, you can also use both of them. That's no worries. We have a dedicated Slack, which you can join. There's a link on that on the external website. This can be used for Q&A and for asking the organizers things and so on and so forth. You can, of course, also use the chat on the website. So we will be monitoring both of these sources. It's just more of a question of preference. Some people prefer Slack because they already have a Slack running as an app. Some people prefer the Rocket Chat. Whatever you use, we will monitor this, and we will see that your questions get asked and answered in important links and resources and some shortened links so that you can actually use them. I'll also put the slides on the official website, on the external website now, which is the one that is mentioned in the NEURLIPS email. So we have a workshop webpage, both an external facing one, which we're hosting on GitHub. This has almost the same information as the internal facing one. The only difference is that the internal facing one also has direct links to the videos and things like this. But other than that, you can also use both of them. That's no worries. We have a dedicated Slack, which you can join. There's a link on that on the external website. This can be used for Q&A and for asking the organizers things and so on and so forth. You can, of course, also use the chat on the website. So we will be monitoring both of these sources. It's just more of a question of preference. Some people prefer Slack because they already have a Slack running as an app. Some people prefer the Rocket Chat. Whatever you use, we will monitor this, and we will see that your questions get asked and answered in the panel discussions. Last, let me point out the GatherTown link. This is for the poster sessions. This you will also find on the external and the internal website. And you can use this GatherTown during the whole of the workshop. There's no, as I said, we won't shut it down. There might not be always people around, but you can wander around. You can take a look at the posters. There's also a connection to the Gather Cafe. So when you walk out on the left side of the map, I placed a door, and you will be teleported to the official rest of the conference. This is something that the organizers gratefully and gracefully added for us. Last, how do you contact us if anything goes amiss? If you wanna know anything else, or if something doesn't work out for you, quickest way is probably to, if you're not on Slack, Twitter, or Rocket Chat, the quickest way is to shoot us an email at workshop@topology.rocks. Yeah, that's a real email address. Didn't make that one up. So workshop@topology.rocks. Other than that, you can also find us on Slack and Twitter and Rocket Chat. So we will be trying to field all the questions that you might have and stuff that doesn't work. So with that, I'm at the end of the slideshow, and I wish you a very nice workshop. I hope that you will find a lot of cool stuff there. We already screened the content, and it's really amazing what we found. We have a nice mix of theoretical and practical things going on there, and we hope that you will enjoy it as much as we did. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very nice workshop today.
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give a keynote address at this workshop on TDA and beyond. My own work in TDA has primarily concerned neuroscience and applications of TDA therein. Today, I'm going to talk about just 2 significant applications of TDA in neuroscience in hopes of whetting your appetite to learn more, and in hopes of inspiring other TDA researchers to consider problems in neuroscience. It's a very broad field in which there are a wide range of possible interesting use cases for neuroscience. Let's set the stage for talking about neuroscience by introducing the primary players in our story, which are neurons. Neurons are the cells in the brain that transmit signals from one place to another, and are involved in information processing. A neuron consists of 3 primary parts that we see in this cartoon. Starting from sort of the top left, we have the dendrites. The dendrites are finger-like structures branching out of the cell body that gather information from other neurons and begin processing that information, transmitting it further to the cell body where the information processing is completed. If there's enough charge that builds up in the cell body, then it emits a spike. So an electrical current that then travels along the axon towards the dendrites of other neurons. The connection points between axons and dendrites are called synapses. Synapses can vary in strength and reliability, which will have an effect on the transmission of the signal from one neuron to another. When studying neurons, one records various kinds of information about their electrical behavior. One possible way of recording information about their behavior is to look at spike trains. Spike trains are time series indicating when the neuron has emitted an electrical pulse, a spike. You can also measure the firing rate of a neuron, which is the number of spikes that it emits within a given time frame. So that's all we're going to say about neurobiology for now. The first application I want to talk about has to do with analyzing the dynamics of a network of neurons. This was joint work with Jean-Baptiste Bardin and Spreeman. It was published in Network Neuroscience in 2019. So why should one be interested in studying neural dynamics? Of course, as mathematicians, we might be interested in studying dynamical systems in general, and here's a particularly nice and interesting one to study. But more particularly, when you're studying the brain, you're interested in how it processes information. If we know something about the possible dynamics of a network of neurons, then maybe we can say something about how that network of neurons processes information. Also, different areas in the brain have different dynamics. It can be interesting to compare the dynamics of different areas of the brain. Also, depending on what role an area of the brain is playing, it can have different patterns of activity. And that is also something we may be interested in distinguishing. Moreover, when you're thinking about neurological disorders, such as Alzheimer's, such as Parkinson's, and so on, these sorts of disorders are often characterized by abnormal dynamics. So if one had a way of characterizing those dynamics, that might be a step forward to understanding perhaps possible treatment regimes. So our goals in this project were rather modest. The first thing was to try to develop some way of applying TDA to developing an automated classification of network dynamics, trying to see how we can use TDA to develop simple features that could be used to describe network dynamics, and then to develop a classifier that could ingest those features and output an identification of a dynamic regime. Also, in the process of developing these TDA tools, we had to have some way of determining how similar the electrical behavior of different neurons was. And it turned out that the kind of features we extracted depended on what kind of similarity measures we were interested in. And so there's an interesting interplay between these measures of similarity that is interesting to study. So let me describe the workflow of our project here. The first thing we did was to construct 3 artificial networks of what are called leaky, integrate, and fire neurons. I'm not going to describe what they are. They have various parameters that one can play with, such as how dense the connections are, what the delay in the synapses, and how strong the synapses are. So recall the synapses are these connections from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another. Once we had those neurons, then we could run simulations of activity, so of spiking behavior of the neurons, where we could vary certain parameters and then see how the dynamics of the network changed depending on those parameters. Once we had that information, the recordings of the spiking times of the neurons, for example, we could then build weighted graphs, which were based on 3 different measures of similarity of spike trains. And once you have weighted graphs, then you're in a territory where you can start applying the tools of topological data analysis. So when you took these weighted graphs, you can build filtered simplicial complexes and compute persistent homology. Then from persistent homology, we could extract certain quite simple features, as you'll see, which we could then use to train a classifier, which enabled us quite well to predict global network dynamics. So let's see in more detail what's involved. Now I'm going to describe the experiments that we carried out in this project. So we had these 3 networks of linky, integrate, and fire neurons. These networks differed in terms of the synaptic properties of the neurons we considered, as well as in terms of their connectivity structure. For each of the 3 networks, we considered 28 different parameter settings. So there were a pair of parameters that we could vary, one of which we varied across 7 possible integer values, the other of which we varied across 4 possible integer values, leading to 28 possible parameter combinations. So for each of the 3 networks and each of these 28 parameter combinations, we carried out 10 trials of simulations of 20 seconds of biological activity, spiking behavior of the neurons in the networks. We recorded the spiking times of all of the neurons. So we created spike trains for each of the neurons in the case of each experiment, and recorded the overall population firing rate for each of these simulations. When we did so, we discovered there were 4 distinct dynamic regimes that developed. First, on the left, we see the one that's called a synchronous regular. So let me explain what's in each of these figures here. So in each panel, in the upper half, where it's labeled neurons, it's what's called a raster plot. So there we have not all of the neurons, because we had 2,500 neurons in each of the networks, but a sample of all of the neurons. And everywhere there's a black tick that corresponds to a spike being emitted by the neuron. So each of all of the neurons. So we created spike trains for each of the neurons in the case of each experiment, and recorded the overall population firing rate for each of these simulations. When we did so, we discovered there were 4 distinct dynamic regimes that developed. First, on the left, we see the one that's called a synchronous regular. So let me explain what's in each of these figures here. So in each panel, in the upper half, where it's labeled neurons, it's what's called a raster plot. So there we have not all of the neurons, because we had 2,500 neurons in each of the networks, but a sample of all of the neurons. And everywhere there's a black tick that corresponds to a spike being emitted by the neuron. So each row, yes, in this diagram corresponds to a particular neuron, and the little black ticks correspond to spiking of the neurons. So we can see, for example, in panel A, that the neurons are all spiking in a very synchronous manner. They're spiking in a very regular pattern. In panel B, they tend to be synchronous, but the pattern is much more irregular. In panel C, the firing of the neurons is quite asynchronous and quite irregular. And then there's a very unusual pattern in regime D that we just called alternative. So we had these 4 different dynamic regimes that appeared in each of the 3 networks, depending on which of the parameter choices we made. So if we look more closely, here we have our 3 networks, which correspond to the panels A, B, and C. So one panel for each of the 3 leaky integrate and fire networks that we considered. And in each of these panels, what we have along the x-axis is a choice of a parameter called G that has to do with conductance. So there were 7 possible choices of G. We were just looking at integer values here. And then along the y-axis, we have 4 possible choices of another parameter, which has to do with input rate. So there we have 4 possibilities. So we have a total of 28 different possibilities. We take integer values each time. And then what these panels illustrate is for what parameter values we found ourselves in each of these particular regimes, the blue being synchronous regular, the green being asynchronous irregular, the yellow being synchronous irregular, and red being the alternative regime. So we see that, and then where we have the white areas in the panel, there was sort of no firing activity at all. So we see that each of the networks exhibits a different partition of this collection of parameter pairs into different regimes. So what we were interested in doing is being able to say, if I just look at recordings of the spiking times of the neurons, and then from that extract some TA parameters, can I predict which regime I am in independently of which of the networks I'm considering? So how do we go from spike trains to weighted graphs? So we have 280 simulations, that is to say 10 trials of each of the 28 possible parameter pairs, and for each of the 3 networks, we're going to associate 3 possible weighted complete graphs, which has 1 node for each of the neurons. We have 2,500 nodes instead of 2,500 neurons. And the 3 weights we've considered were given by looking at similarity measures called Pearson correlation, spike synchronicity, and spike distance, which detect different things about the similarity of spike trains. So for example, here are 2 spiking patterns of 2 neurons called neuron 1 and neuron 2. Along the y-axis, we show there's time in milliseconds. And below this panel, you see the measures of similarity, Pearson correlation, spike synchronicity, or spike distance. You see they're all quite different, so they're detecting different things about the similarity between these spiking patterns. So each of those gives a different weight on this complete graph. And once we have those weighted graphs, then we can look at the associated filtered simplicial complexes. I want to explain now how we extracted topological features from the experiments that we ran. So we had all of these weighted graphs for each of the 280 experiments. We had 3 different weighted graphs we constructed based on the 3 different similarity measures. And we associated to each of these weighted graphs its filtered flag complex. Now recall that the weights, because they're 1 minus similarity measures, the weights vary from 0 to 1. And so we could associate to these weighted graphs, where the weights on the edges are between 0 and 1, a filtered flag complex. So we'll call it f star of g for the weighted graph g. F star of g is a collection of, or a filtration of simplicial complex. Fr of g is going to be then a simplicial complex whose n simplices are just the sets of vertices v0 up to vn of the graph g, such that the weight of every edge is at most r. So what we're going to do is build the filtration of the simplicial complex where we're including the edges gradually as we increase the r that we consider. And then to each of these filtered flag complexes, we'll associate the Betti0 and Betti1 curves. So recall that the Betti0 and Betti1 curves are going to associate to some, they're going to be functions that associate to an r between 0 and 1, the dimension of either the 0th homology of fr of g, or the dimension of the 1 homology, this is all with f2 coefficients, of fr of g. So what is our classifier? Well, from these Betti0 and Betti1 curves, we extract 6 topological features that have the highest mutual information with respect to the regime labels, so these 4 regimes that were possible. One is the area under the Betti0 curve for each of the 3 similarity measures. The other is the area under the Betti1 curve for the correlation and spike synchronicity similarity measures. And the third is the maximum of the Betti1 curve for the spike distance. So that gives us 6 topological features. And using those 6 topological features, we trained a regularized support vector machine to be able to detect the different regimes. And the results are pretty good. If we look at the classification accuracy, so when we compare the possible training sets, for example, version 1, so this is, we have our 3 possible networks, version 1, 2, and 3. And we train on version 1, that is to say, we take some fraction of version 1 to use to train the classifier, and then we test on the experiments coming from either version 1 itself or experiments coming from version 2 or version 3, or even all 3 of them, to see how well we can classify. And we see the classification accuracy is quite high. In particular, if we test on the same version which we trained, then the accuracy is 100%. And it's even pretty good if we, for example, train on version 1 and test on version 3, then we have over 91% accuracy. If we train on version 3 and test on version 1, then we have over 99% accuracy. And if we train on a set which is extracted from all 3 of the versions, then we actually get perfect accuracy for all of the versions. So what are the conclusions of this research? That it's possible to perfectly predict network regimes just with a few simple features extracted from persistent homology. This was actually surprising to me, that something as simple as the area under the curve or the maximum of the curve could provide that much information to be able to predict network regimes. Our classifier generalizes well. It's always good to see. And that the performance of the classifier is actually improved by combining measures of different kinds of similarity. So one shouldn't just focus on one of the three possible measures, but use combinations thereof to extract more information. Ongoing work along these lines is to test it on more complex networks. Leaky, integrate, and fire neurons are very simplistic, so you'd like to have neurons and synapses that are closer to real biology. You'd like to see what happens when you play with the underlying graph, whether that with its type, if it's a Erdős-Rényi or preferential attachment or something like that, or to even test this on true biological spiking data. You also want to analyze perhaps other types of neural data, not just spiking data, such as the firing rate or what's happening with the neuron voltages through time. Moreover, it'd be really interesting to develop an unsupervised version of this sort of classifier so that you could perhaps even detect previously unknown and perhaps ephemeral regimes of dynamics in the brain, which could be really interesting for understanding phenomena such as epilepsy or other such of neurological disorders. The second project I want to talk about has to do with classification of neuron morphologies. This is research that's been led primarily by Lida Canari from the Blue Brain Project. So neuron morphologies are actually quite complex. The cartoon that I showed you earlier made them look very simple, but in this illustration, we see visualizations of pyramidal cells, excitatory cells from rat cortex, and you see there's actually a wide diversity of size and branching structure and number of branches and curvature, all sorts of features that vary quite a lot. And neuron morphology is very important for neuron function, so it's really important to be able to classify neurons according to their morphology, according to their shape. So how does one do so? If one makes a comparison, like the two neurons that are drawn in this illustration here, how can we compare them and characterize their similarities and their differences? So the tool that we developed for that is called the topological morphology descriptor, or TMD, that takes a neuron. Here, there's a cartoon again of a neuron, of a tree structure. We look at a neuron as a tree with a root, which is at the cell body. And we slowly take that tree and break it up into its branches in a progressive way. So starting at the farthest out leaf and descending recursively to the root, you just break off the tree into its various branches, giving rise to a barcode or to a persistence diagram, if that's what you prefer. So starting, for example, at H, you move towards the node J. At the node J, you say, okay, there's a bifurcation. Which branch am I going to break off? You're following the elder rule, which says that at a bifurcation, you're going to break off the younger branch and create a bar in your barcode and continue on with the farther out, the longer branch. So for example, if I continue on from J to D, at D, I have the branch with a leaf at H, and a branch with a leaf at E. Because the leaf at E is closer to the root, that's the one I'm going to break off and leave and use it recorded as a bar in the barcode. And we progress this way until we've broken up the whole tree into its branches and we have the associated barcode. And you can ask, well, how stable is this choice? Turns out that if you've made small errors of measurement in the exact location of the branches, or you've missed certain little branches that you should have recorded, that the TMD is actually stable with respect to the bottleneck distance with respect to these sort of small errors of reconstruction. So that's reassuring. Topological morphology descriptor turns out to be very useful for classification of neurons. So going back to the example that we considered before, what one does is take the barcode or associated persistence diagram and instead look at the persistence image, where you put a Gaussian kernel at each point of the persistence diagram, and it gives you these lovely persistence images. These are easier to use for classification. One can actually do statistics with persistence images, and enables you to see very clearly where the differences are between your neurons. So the neuron on the left has much more of a tuft out at the end, and that's represented by the hot point out in the upper right-hand corner of the square. The The neuron on the right has less of a tuft, and therefore there's less of a hotspot in its diagram. The heat map that's at the top is given by subtracting one of these from the other, which really makes evident where the differences are between the two neurons. So one can use the TMD to do all kinds of classifications, such as doing interspecies comparison. So here are neurons from cat, dragonfly, fruit fly, mouse, and rat. One looks at the associated TMD barcodes, the associated persistence diagrams and persistence images. And then what you have in column D are the average persistence images for a whole population, a whole collection of neurons of that type. And it makes it clear what the differences are among these. And one uses these sorts of persistence images as input to a classifier again. And you can train the classifier, which in this case is a decision tree, and you can come up with quite an accurate classification, as you can see from the confusion matrix in panel A. And it even is fairly accurate. The accuracy of the classifier increases rapidly with the size of the training set. So that already, if your training set is the size of 40% or 50% of the whole set, then you're already up to 80% classification accuracy. In a paper that appeared in Cerebral Cortex, we used the TMD in order to establish an objective classification of pyramidal cells in rat cortex. So pyramidal cells are excitatory neurons, and we're looking at the excitatory neurons that one finds in the cortex of a rat. Now, neurons are sorted according to the layer of the cortex in which the cell body can be found. So if we look at this figure here, there are 6 different layers in cortex, from layer 1, which is closest to the surface of the cortex, to layer 6, which is deepest within the brain. And here we have the pyramidal cells of a rat that are classified. So there are cartoons here that are drawn showing you by layer the different pyramidal cells, where, as we said, the neuron is classified according to a layer if its cell body is in that layer. Now, what we did was to take digital reconstructions of rat neurons and use those as a population input to the topological morphology descriptor, look at the associated TMD, the associated persistence image, use those persistence images to provide a classification, and compare that classification with the known classifications. Now, essentially, ever since the beginning of neuroscience and the work of Ramon y Cajal, neuroscientists have been wanting to classify neurons according to their morphology. They're often classified by experts who have a subjective knowledge, by experts who have a deep knowledge of what neuron morphologies look like and who can, by just using their judgment, figure out what class a neuron belongs to. Or one uses what are called morphometrics, so numbers such as the number of branches, the depth of the tree, curvature. There are various numerical values one can associate to a neuron to study, to describe its shape. And one can use vectors made up of different morphometrics as descriptors of the neurons and try to use those for classification. Now, it turns out that if you ask 2 different experts to classify the same neurons, they often will not do so exactly the same way. You can even ask the same expert on 2 different days to do a classification and not get the same classification. And if, depending on which morphometrics you use to classify neurons, you're going to end up with different classifications. So it was important to come up with some sort of objective classification, which we did using the topological morphology descriptor. Now, it turned out that using the TMD and using standard classification techniques applied to persistence images, the classification that we obtained confirmed largely that had been determined by experts in the field. One exception to that was in layer 3. So these L3 TPCs, they're listed called A and B there. Turns out that in the experts classification, there was actually and not get the same classification. And if depending on which morphometrics you use to classify neurons, you're going to end up with different classifications. So it was important to come up with some sort of objective classification, which we did using the topological morphology descriptor. Now, it turned out that using the TMD and using standard classification techniques applied to persistence images, the classification that we obtained confirmed largely that had been determined by experts in the field. One exception to that was in layer 3. So these L3 TPCs, they're listed called A and B there. Turns out that in the experts classification, there was actually some confusion. If we look at the image here in panel A, we have the two classifications that were determined by the experts. And in panel D, you see that there's some overlap, some confusion between the two classes. By applying these methods, this more objective method of the topological morphology descriptor, leading in the end, so in panel C, we see the original confusion matrix using the expert classification. In panel E, the confusion matrix that you get after sort of cleaning up the expert classification using the topological morphology descriptor. So it really helps with this sort of objective classification. One can also apply the TMD in the case of human cells. So these are human pyramidal cells. And this was part of a project that Lida carried out with the group of Idan Segev at Hebrew University, where they were interested in classifying human pyramidal cells based on their electrical behavior, but it was hard to come up with a classification just using standard statistical methods. Lida applied the TMD in order to come up with a morphological classification of the human pyramidal cells, which then made it easier to understand the classification in terms of electrical behavior. Again, the form, the shape of a neuron is related to its function, so it's not surprising that if one can come up with a morphological characterization of neurons, it should have something to do with their electrical behavior as well. So we're able to divide it quite nicely into two classes that are either slim or profusely tufted. So this is a very simple TDA method, but it turns out to be quite powerful for providing a reliable objective classification of tree-like structures, in particular of neurons, which is extremely useful and interesting for neuroscience. We have a number of promising ongoing projects related to the TMD. The first of which concerns the inverse problem. We have a way, the TMD provides us with a way of associating to any kind of tree embedded in Euclidean space a barcode. And one can ask, well, can you go backwards? Given a barcode, can you reconstruct a geometric tree? What are the possible geometric trees that could give rise to that barcode? In the particular context of neuroscience, Lida Canari has created an algorithm called topological neuron synthesis that produces from a barcode or from a population of barcodes that are the TMD of neurons, geometric trees that have the same sort of morphological characteristics as actual neurons. We're currently studying in joint work with Lida and with Atelier Guérin the relationship between the TMD and topological neuron synthesis. The second interesting direction is to apply this to glia, to other sorts of nerve cells that one finds in the brain, such as astrocytes, microglia, and perhaps even oligodendrocytes. To use these for classification of, for example, microglia under various conditions of inflammation, for example. You can also use the TMD to try to come up with a way of comparing neurons between different areas in the brain or comparing neurons between different species. Within the Blue Brain project, they've developed an improved machine learning pipeline involving the topological morphology descriptor, which exploits graph neural networks and Pursley, for example. I've collaborated with a number of wonderful collaborators geometric trees that have the same sort of morphological characteristics as actual neurons. We're currently studying in joint work with Lida and with Atelier Guérin the relationship between the TMD and topological neuron synthesis. A second interesting direction is to apply this to glia, to other sorts of nerve cells that one finds in the brain, such as astrocytes, microglia, and perhaps even oligodendrocytes. To use these for classification of, for example, microglia under various conditions of inflammation, for example. You can also use the TMD to try to come up with a way of comparing neurons between different areas in the brain or comparing neurons between different species. Within the Blue Brain project, they've developed an improved machine learning pipeline involving the topological morphology descriptor, which exploits graph neural networks and Pursley, for example. I've collaborated with a number of wonderful collaborators on this project, some of whom are no longer at EPFL. There's also Ran Levy, Pavel Blatko, and Yun Wang, who've worked with us, and a whole team of wonderful people from within the Blue Brain project and the Laboratory for Neural Microcircuits at EPFL. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Vidit Nanda, and I'm very, very grateful to the organizers for giving me a chance to speak with all of you about singularity detection in data. This is joint work with my Oxford colleagues, Bernadette Stoltz, Jared Tanner, and Heather Harrington. The starting point of this work was our desire to investigate the manifold hypothesis. Now, a manifold, if you want the technical definition, is one of the nicest kinds of topological spaces on the planet. So these are spaces which locally look like Euclidean space of some dimension. So a k-dimensional manifold, if you zoom in, it's a space where if you zoom in, what you see is just flat k-dimensional Euclidean space. And if you'd like some examples, in dimension 0, every manifold should locally look like zero-dimensional space, which is a point. So it's just a disjoint, disconnected union of points. If you'd like to think about what manifolds in one dimension are, well, they could be the line, or they could be some sort of curve like this, and that's it. Things get slightly more exciting in 2 dimensions. You can have spheres and tori, but something with holes like what's drawn here. And of course, in dimensions 3 and beyond, things get much harder to draw, and I'm absolutely not going to try drawing a 4-dimensional manifold here. The point is, these are nice spaces, and in fact, they're so nice that we tend to sort of tacitly assume that a lot of spaces encountered in data analysis are really manifolds, whether or not they are. So the hypothesis, the manifold hypothesis, is that is the assumption that if someone hands you a data set in n-dimensional Euclidean space, in fact, it's not really occupying all of that space or even like a large volume chunk. It's occupying a small dimensional submanifold of intrinsic dimension k, which is much, much smaller than the full dimension of n, maybe with a bit of noise. The point about this assumption is that it's easy to violate. You don't have to think very, very hard to come up with examples where the manifold hypothesis is not satisfied. For example, the intersection of these 2 red and blue planes on the right of the screen. If you're on just the red part, fine, it looks like 2-dimensional space. If you're just on the blue part, fine, it still looks like 2-dimensional space. But the minute you're on that black line where they intersect, neighborhoods of that line, points in that line, don't look like a single plane. They, of course, have to look like 2 planes because both planes are going through those points. And that's not Euclidean space of dimension 1, it's not Euclidean space of dimension 2, that's something else entirely. That's called a singularity. So anytime you sample points from a space that admits singularities, like this union of planes, you end up violating the manifold hypothesis. So our goal in this work is to take a data set and chop it up into pieces so that on each single piece, the manifold hypothesis is correctly satisfied. So if someone gave you points on the red plane and the blue plane and the black line, the goal of this work would be able to split them apart into, the points living on the plane and the points living on the line. So let's see how that's done. Maybe if someone just threw this problem at you, you'd think about some. You construct a local neighborhood. So take a tiny radius around each point, look at all the pairwise distances of points that lie within that small distance, let's say epsilon of your point x, and look at the positive distance matrix where you arrange all the points along the rows and columns, and in the ijth spot is the distance from the ith point to the jth point. Remember, all of these are just living in a tiny disk of radius epsilon around x. Okay, once you have this distance matrix, you compute some sort of singular value type decomposition, break it up. So you have a sequence of singular values. Let's say they're decreasing along the diagonal entries of that matrix delta in the middle. And now the columns of U correspond to these top singular values, the first few columns of U, and these will roughly store a basis for the tangent space at X. So you can start trying to figure out dimensions just from looking at SVD, which is a good start to solving our problem. So let's try. What would the SVD for those points living on a plane in three-dimensional space look like? Well, you'd have two big singular values and basically 0 for the third singular value, because it just takes 2 dimensions to approximate the tangent space. And if you were genuinely filling out 3 dimensions, then of course you have 3 reasonably large non-zero-ish singular values. The trouble is, when you start having singularities, points near the singular line, again, this is 2 planes. This is the example we had before. Points in that line are going to have distance matrices whose vectors actually span 3-dimensional space. So again, you're going to get 3 dimensions, 3 big singular values, and you cannot tell this apart from the case where the points were genuinely filling out 3-dimensional space. And this works even for different types of singularities. I mean, even with that plane with a line going through, even though that thing never has any 3-dimensional structure to it, when you look at the points near the singular origin there, where the line and the plane intersect, you end up with 3 non-zero singular values. So SVD doesn't quite do what we want it to do here. So we're going to upgrade our machinery and look at a more general framework for studying singularities. And this is the theory of stratified spaces, a very, very beautiful endeavor in algebraic geometry and topology, which I will absolutely not be able to get into the depths of in the next, 9-ish minutes. So let's just get through the definition. That's all. That's our only goal right now. To understand what a stratified space is, just the definition. So an n-dimensional stratification of a space is a filtration. So you start with the empty set being the minus for one step, and then x0 sits inside x1, sits inside x2, and all the way up to xn, where we get the whole space, so that each difference is a manifold. So now you're building your space out of manifolds. And if that was it, then this wouldn't be very exciting, because any way you could decompose a space into manifolds would count as a stratification. What you want to ensure is that along a single piece, a single manifold, when you take neighborhoods of points in those pieces, you see the same picture. The way for a manifold you see RK everywhere. You want to see the same sort of space everywhere. So there's a technical condition that has to be satisfied. It's a mouthful, and I'm going to leave it there for you to read, but maybe the nice thing to do is just explain it with a few examples. So the best family of examples come from simplicial complexes. So if you imagine here's a simplicial complex, and we want to describe a neighborhood of that point, the vertex in the middle, in terms of stratification. So basically a neighborhood around that point looks like what's called the cone on the blue set. So to build a cone on the blue set, take the blue set, add a point, and then connect lines from that point through to everything in the blue set. So that looks exactly like, if you had it, if the blue set was a round circle, then you'd have an honest cone. But in this case, you get a sort of jagged cone. Okay, a little bit harder is that edge. Now that edge looks like the cone on those two red points cross a line. So, which is to say, there is a product decomposition of this sort. So what you should keep in mind is that neighborhoods of points in a given stratum decompose as products, and the one side of the product is just a power of r, which is a dimension of the manifold. So this is the tangential part. So this is tangent. If you look along it, this is the manifold part, and then this is the more exotic non-tangent part. This is called the normal part. So the normal part is always conical in a stratified space. It's a cone over some boundary type. Okay, so how would we detect such a thing? Since this is a workshop on TDA, I think it should be safe to say that you've seen homology before, but if you haven't, the cartoon definition is that homology is a device that eats pairs of topological spaces, A sitting inside B, and spits out a family of vector spaces indexed by the natural numbers. And it has various nice, convenient properties. The dimension of H0 counts the number of pieces, the dimension of H1 counts tunnels, etc. There's lots of good books, and I hope you read some of them, and so I don't have to define all of homology. So in fact, this talk, in order to understand it, you only need to know the homologies of a few types of spaces. But let's see how good homology is at telling apart different types of disks. Remember, all our neighborhoods were disks, so what we want is a tool for telling you when you have a k-dimensional disk, so a k-dimensional manifold versus a k plus one dimensional disk. Well, it turns out homology is terrible at telling this apart. So when n is bigger than 1, then the ith homology of the disk of dimension n is r if I is 0 and 0 otherwise, which means 2-dimensional disks, 17-dimensional disks, 18-dimensional disks all have the same homology. This is terrible for us. So it looks like TDA, at least the main tool of TDA homology, will not be a good way forward. But we're ignoring the second space. If you add in a convenient second space, in this case the boundary of the disk, which is a sphere of dimension 1 less, then you get the perfect manifold detector. This homology class, this homology of dn Sn minus 1, it spikes up. It is dimension 1 when I equals n, and it's 0 all the other times. So this is the homology we really like. Based on what we want this local manifold property to be satisfied. The local homology of the space is the homology of x minus p at any point p. And if x is a manifold of dimension n, then this is exactly the same as the homology of dn at Sn minus 1. So this is our tester. This is what we'd like. Of course, we don't get nice manifolds. We're trying to do this with data, and there are a few problems. So if you have a data set, you might want to try and triangulate it, and then you have some sort of manifold-like space. The trouble is most triangulations don't respect dimension at all. They're not dimensionally faithful, so you could take points in 2-dimensional space and get triangulations with the simplices of dimension 500. The second problem is that almost surely you're not going to sample any singular points, like that point between those two spheres where things don't look like a manifold. If you take a random sample, you're never going to hit it. And third, the standard tool when you don't have a manifold but rather just points is persistent homology. And persistent homology is not very good at figuring out estimating the homology of pairs like dn Sn minus 1. It's great if you have only one space, but pairs are hard. So what we do here is we take a look at annular persistent homology. So here's a one-dimensional manifold. You have some points with noise sample near it, take an annulus around a point, and you see the types of points that line that annulus are on either side. So this looks like S0, the zero-dimensional sphere. If you had a singularity, then you get 4 types of intersections, and then you wouldn't be a zero sphere. So this feeds into a slightly technical thing, which is called a long exact sequence, which says that the homology we care about, finding dn(Sn-1), is the same as the ordinary homology of sphere empty set, and the sphere empty set homology is well approximated by annular patches. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to detect singularities in data. I'll give you an example. It's not the hardest thing one can do, but this is an important thing you can do. So if you have 2 n-dimensional manifolds and I give you point samples on the union, what I'm able to do with this machinery is classify points, partition them into 3 sets: the manifold-like points, the points that are on the edges, the boundaries, and then the singular ones, the intersection ones, which are sort of the thing we wanted to find in the first place. And all you need is 2 parameters. It's not a deep learning thing with 5 billion parameters. It's 2, which control the size of the annuli. And so here's the algorithm. Take a point, compute persistent homology of that an annulus around that point of all the neighbors, count the number of bars of length bigger than the thickness of the annulus. If you get 0, then you had a point on the boundary. If you get 1 bar exactly, then you had a point in the manifold parts. Anything else, you're living near a singularity. And we tried this on a couple of data sets. So here's one of sphere intersect a Klein bottle along 2 circles, and there you can see we find the circles. Here's a fake data set coming from a surface, and again, we find all the intersections. And here we test that it's much more robust than local SVD type computations. It works for much better radii. Okay, well, that's the end of my talk. Thank you for attending. If you want to learn more, read that first paper by Stoltz, Tanner, Harrington, and me, which appeared in PNAS. And if you'd like different take on these things, please try the local cohomology and stratification paper. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining TDA workshop from all over the world. I'm Izuru Yamakage, working at Fujitsu, Japanese ICT company, as an AI practitioner. Dear workshop committee, thank you for inviting me this great workshop, and I'm really proud of contributing these academic activities. In this session, I'll give you several use cases that cutting-edge technology TDA is applied in practical application and research activities. Before starting my presentation, let me introduce my company, Fujitsu. Fujitsu is the biggest ICT company in Japan, and also one of the biggest ICT vendor all over the world. We are running a system integration service and IT information providing service all over the world, over 180 countries. And we, Fujitsu Group, owns a research and development subsidiary, Fujitsu Laboratories. In Fujitsu Lab, more than thousands of researchers are working in order to develop new cutting-edge technology from hardware to software, especially for AI algorithms. And Fujitsu Lab is conducting collaborative research project with India, French National Institute. And in this project, we have developing new TDA algorithms with India. Not only this research project, we aim to contribute OSS community throughout this collaboration. For example, outcome of this TDA research is disclosed as a package of the OSS TDA software goodie. And also, we contribute the well-known machine learning OSS scikit-learn community, which is run by India Foundation. Throughout this collaboration, we have strengthened our TDA capabilities, and now we are trying to find the business application area where TDA is effective. So let me start the technical session from here. This picture shows the advantage of TDA from a practitioner's viewpoint. Right-hand side left-hand side shows the statistical data analysis conventional way. In this data pipeline, we use distribution functions, and it means peripheral data is less important, underestimate. But TDA, right-hand side, can grasp whole data at once, and it can depict characteristic features those conventional methods could not find. This is a great advantage of TDA. And we applied this TDA to time series data. First of all, let me explain briefly time series data pipeline with TDA. We convert time series data into a point cloud using Tarken's embedding theorem. It can create attractors. The shape of attractor represents the hidden dynamics of time series data. And shape of the attractor shows the characteristic feature of this time series data, especially. We apply TDA to abstract the characteristic feature of this shape of the attractor. In this pipeline, we can abstract a good characteristic feature without a complicated and domain-specific feature engineering way. So first use cases, let me explain. This is infrastructure maintenance empowered by AI, TDA. In 2012, in Japan, we had a severe, terrible accident, broken down of the tunnel on highway. So many people were killed, and logistics system in Japan was severely damaged. Because of that, Japanese government has decided to reinforce the maintenance health check of those outdated infrastructures. But we had almost a million of bridges which has almost more than 50 years old, and it is very essentially necessary to have a sophisticated way to monitor the health of bridges. And picture like on the bottom shows a 2D image of the bridge monitoring system. Sensors are attached beneath of the bridge, and data were collected and transferred throughout the network and accumulated onto the cloud. Bridge maintainers can analyze those data by AI, and AI technologies shows which data is maintained at first. In order to develop these kind of systems, Japanese government started the national project, and we joined. This project is funded by the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transportation. The research group manufacturing a mock bridge, as shown here. Inside the bridge, the distortion sensor were embedded, and acceleration sensor were attached on the back. And we applied the pressure onto the mock bridge and conducting enduring test, as shown here. These endurance tests last 4 months, and finally this mock bridge was broken, and we collected the data. This picture shows the experimental result. Horizontal axis is year estimated, and the longitudinal axis shows the internal strain corrected from the inertial strain sensor embedded inside the bridge. As shown here, the gradually the internal strain is increased. Upper picture shows the converted vibration data. It means attractor of acceleration sensor. As clearly shown here, shape of the attractor gradually changed as inertial internal strain is increased. And change of the attractor is depicted by TDA. And we, even though this is on the project, but we can say we have developed a genuine non-destructive inspection method for the infrastructure like bridges and tunnels. Next use case is very different from the previous one, arrhythmia detection. Arrhythmia is an irregular heartbeat. Some types of arrhythmia should be detected early to predict the severe heart disease. And it is very important issue to distinguish accurately whether the detected arrhythmia is severe or not normal. Like this ECG data. And we applied the TDA on this. By combining with TDA with the deep learning technology, CNN, our research group could successfully develop the classification algorithms which can estimate the type of the heart disease and decrease the number of the misclassification. This table shows the experimental result compared with previous research outcome. Within our best knowledge, we could say our technology is the state-of-the-art arrhythmia detection technology. And now we are conducting the collaborative research project with professional clinicians and develop this prototype R&D arrhythmia detection into a practical application. The final use case is an outcome of CSNAP and our collaborator India. CSNAP is a French SME that develops innovative technologies for navigation without GPS and high-precision movement analysis from inertial data generated from their own devices. Their technology is used in various application areas from medical domain to security and defense. It uses TDA to monitor and analyze with high precision that movements and activities of the patients at home during several months or years during medical studies. Here, the patients are suffering from neuromuscular disorder due to Parkinson's disease. Patients were equipped with a small inertial device worn at wrist and ankle, and registers their movement. The goal was to monitor patients' activities and detect dyskinesia crises that are characterized by uncontrolled and disordered movement of the patients from generated data. But we met the difficulties of this task coming from the fact like the data are collected in the non-controlled environment, it means at home. And they are usually very chaotic with high variability among the patients. And events of the interest, dyskinesia crises, are very rare and there are very few relevant data for training. To overcome these difficulties, the adapted approach has been designed a specific TDA network to use with more standard multi-channel CNN. The benefit of adding TDA was not only to improve the performance of the machine learning model, but also to gain in robustness and ability to generalize. As it is not possible to show the result obtained on the medical data due to confidentiality, that table on the right-hand side shows the performance of the TDA-based architecture on the publicly available data set for activity recognition with very similar characteristics than medical data. The column gives the result for the different models, and the last one, colored one, last one is the data using the TDA machine learning model. And this result also shows the great benefit of TDA. Before closing my presentation, as a practitioner, I would like to request to the AI academicians to develop new technologies, XAI by TDA. In the practical AI business, so many customers requested us to show the reason why this AI system output this specific result. As you know, it is impossible or very difficult to explain why this black box AI model show this result. But XAI is one of the essential problems to be solved in AI area. And I believe TDA can do that because TDA can abstract hidden features as those traditional methods cannot depict, and depicted feature has mathematical background, and these mathematical background can make the black boxed AI systems clearer and helps AI to show the reason those our customers requested. This is my sincere and request to the AI academicians all over the world. Thank you for your kind attention, and any comments, suggestions, and advices are truly appreciated. Thank you so much.
G'day everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about Wasserstein stability for persistence diagrams. This is work joint with Primož Škraba, and if you're interested, please look at the archive paper under the same name. Okay, so what would Wasserstein stability mean? Okay, so Wasserstein is a distance between persistence diagrams. So we're going to say we've got two persistence diagrams generated by functions, and to have stability, we want to have the Wasserstein distance between these persistence diagrams bounded by some sort of distance between the functions themselves, the input. Okay, so what will the take-home message of this talk be? If we have sub-level set filtrations of the same cellular complex, we will have the Wasserstein distance between the persistence diagrams is bounded by the function distance over the cellular complex. So P and P, all right? So let's just backtrack a bit. What am I defining these functions on? What are these allowed to be? So I have a fixed cellular complex, and then I have a function f that goes from my cellular complex to R. In order to even define persistent homology by sublevel sets, we want to make sure that the sublevel sets are subcomplexes, and this condition is what we call monotone. Okay, it's very standard. Now, from these sublevel set filtrations, we can build persistence diagrams. We can also build barcodes. These are the same thing, just different representations, okay? Modulo some endpoint closed versus open. but the distances between these things are the same. So I'm often actually going to use the barcode representation because it's easier to sort of draw things. Okay. So I'm wanting Wasserstein distance between them. Wasserstein distance is defined in terms of matchings. Okay, so if I have two different persistence diagrams, okay, I can think about the points that are off the diagonal and I need to match them up. Okay, so I need a matching that goes from one set to the other, but I also include the diagonal as an option so that we have sort of a bijection modulo the diagonal. Right, so here's an example. I have a blue X diagram and a red Y diagram, and I'm matching the points next to the points in Y, right? So I've got a matching there. And I can also do the same thing by matching bars in the barcode, okay? Same idea, just a different representation. Okay, so my Wasserstein distance is the infimum of the costs for all these different matchings, okay? So my P cost is going to be the sums of the LP distances between the points, okay, or between the bars. And then I take the sum of these p powers and then take the p root. Okay, standard. Right, the bottleneck distance, which I'm hoping everyone has heard of, is just the limit as you take p to infinity. Okay, which means you get a maximum rather than a sum, or a supremum rather than a sum. Okay, so here is that example again where I have my Wasserstein distance. So what I've circled here is a matching that is optimal. It achieves that infimum. And so my Wasserstein distance is shown as below, and I can write the same thing with barcodes. Now, the key thing here I want to demonstrate with the barcodes is I can look at all those little green intervals. And so if I take the p powers of the lengths of all those bars and I add them up, that's going to be the peak power of the p Wasserstein distance. Okay. Now, on the right-hand side of the equation, I talked about an LP distance between the functions. Okay, so it's very crucial here that they're over the same cellular complex. Otherwise, and thinking about that cellular complex as being effectively set. LP distance between functions over a set is just you add up the differences over each of the cells separately. Stated concretely, as I have two monotone functions over the same cellular complex, then the diagrams from their sublevel set filtrations, okay, the Wasserstein distance between them is bounded by the function distance. Okay. So my hope in this proof is give you an idea of the proof of this. Okay, I love a proof in each talk. Right. So we're going to start with a local case. So what does local mean here? Local is going to mean that the order of the cells is the same. Okay, and then the general case will be done by looking at the local case with linear interpolation. Okay, so let's look at the same order, cellular stability. So how would I phrase this? I'm going to have a path of functions, all right, such that at least in the interior of the path, I have the same order of the cells. So tau always comes before sigma, the whole for all of my t in the path, okay? So if that's the case, then I can bound the Wasserstein distance for the diagrams on the endpoints by that of the function distance. Okay, so let's look at a sort of sketch proof. Okay, so I have my set K, nice simple set K, all right, and I'm going to have two functions f and g, which I'm going to kind of draw going as time evolves. Okay, and so got my orange, and then my blue, and then my yellow, and then my green, and then my red. Okay, so the order of the cells are the same, but the function values at which they actually sort of exactly appear wiggle a little bit. Okay, so this is a very local case. All right, so if we draw the barcodes from this, okay, one key thing you can see is that I can actually identify the same sort of cells in the cell complexes as the critical cells for that persistent homology. Okay, you can think of this in a sort of Morse theory perspective. Okay, now recall that the Wasserstein distance is the infimum of the cost over all the possible matchings. So if we're wanting to bound the Wasserstein distance from above, it's okay just to bound any particular matching, all right? It's enough to show that it's bounded for some matching, okay? Because then it'll be bounded for the infimum, okay? So let's take those two barcodes, and then we're going to choose the obvious matching, okay? So the obvious matching is going to be where we pair the cells with the same endpoints as their labels, okay? So this is only possible because we chose these things to have the same order. Okay, this is only possible to do locally, all right? So I match my orange with my orange, so those are the same essential classes. I match the blue to the yellow with the blue to the yellow, and I match the green to the red with the green to the red. So that's my matching. And then I can say, well, what's the distance? What's the cost of this matching? And it's just going to be the perturbation of each of these cells. Okay, so I'm looking at the sum over all the cells, how far they move to the P, all right? Take the P root over that sum. That is going to be the cost of that matching. Now the Wasserstein distance is going to be the infimum over all matchings. So we have a bound by this LP function distance. So let's state the general theorem, okay, so that we've proved it in the local case. So this is the general case. The general case is any two monotone functions over the same cellular complex, we still have the stability result. So how would we prove that? We prove that by saying, all right, I'm going to make a path, okay, for ft, where t goes from 0 to 1, okay, where at t equals 0, it's f, and at t equals 1, it's g, okay, and then I'm doing linear interpolation between the two. Okay, so what we can see here is that we don't have the same order all the way from 0 to 1. But we can split up this interval, okay, I've put this little t equals a in here, okay, such that over that interval from 0 to a, I have the same order. I always have sigma and then tau, all right? And then on the other subinterval, I also have the same order. The order is switched from the previous, but I have the same order on that, on each of those subintervals, okay? Because I have a finite cellular complex at all but finitely many values, I have this sort of constant ordering. Okay. Now, the lemma we proved, that local lemma, told us that on each of these subintervals, we can apply that stability result. And then linear interpolation is going to actually relate those sublevels to the distance for the whole interval. So we do triangle inequality. We do our little local lemma. We then do linear interpolation and then telescoping sub. Okay. So let's think, we've proved our cellular stability, and I love a cellular stability, comes up occasionally. But we also want to think about other applications, and some are direct corollaries, some involve a little bit more massaging. Okay, and in the paper we think about a couple of other stability results. So we think about the application to grayscale image analysis. So here you almost get the same thing, but you have to have a constant. So we're talking about pixel values, you have a cubical complex, you get stability, but you get a constant in there to do with a dimension, okay, 2 versus 3-dimensional image. Okay, we also have a stability result for the persistent homology transform. Here we're thinking about 2 different embeddings of the same fixed abstract simplicial complex. And so you want to bound the distance between the persistent homology transforms in terms of the distance between the embeddings. Okay. And the third application we thought about was RIPS filtration. So here the distance is not so much between functions, but between point clouds. Before I go, I just want to put a little teaser out there for an algebraic perspective. So up until now, we've been very concrete. We've got a simplicial complex. I'm going to do linear interpolations, very geometric. Okay, so I'm just going to think about the algebra from it. We want to think about Wasserstein stability on a persistence module level. Okay, that's the way life's going now. So the first hurdle is to think, well, what is the Wasserstein distance between persistence modules? I mean, this isn't even defined, okay? We have the bottleneck, we have interleaving, but this does not extend to Wasserstein, okay? So what our approach is to first start with a norm, okay? What is the norm of a persistence module? Okay, and this here is we take our persistence module, we think about an interval decomposition. Okay, we're going to have nice enough persistence modules that they have an interval decomposition. And then our P norm is just going to be the lengths of the bars to the pth power. Sum them up, take the pth root. Okay, so that's our P norm. And this is related to the Wasserstein distance because the pth norm is sort of a constant multiple of the distance from the diagram from that persistence module to the diagram. Okay. The next step is to think about kernels and co-kernels, all right? Seems a little out of the blue, but trust me on this. So if we have two persistence modules and we have a morphism between them, the kernels and the co-kernels are both persistence modules. Now, I'm now going to define the span of persistence modules because we can't do our Wasserstein distance from a single morphism. Instead, we have to take some object and then do morphisms from that object to both A and to B. All right, so this is what we call the span, or a span of A and B, because it's clearly not unique. So we have a persistence module and morphisms from it to A and B. Okay, from that, we can think about this diagram and stick in those kernels and co-kernels. Told you they would come up. And we can define a P cost for this. All right, so this is sort of analogous to a matching cost. Okay, so the P cost of this spanning object is the sum of a bunch of P norms. All right, and this is the kicker. The Wasserstein distance between the diagrams produced from some persistence modules is the same as the infimum of the P costs of all the possible spans between them. So this means that we can define a Wasserstein distance between the persistence modules in terms of these P costs. And you can prove Wasserstein stability directly on the persistence module level using these spanning objects. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all at NEURLIPS.
So hello all, and thank you for this opportunity to speak at the TDA workshop. So today I'll be presenting some work that we had gotten accepted at ICML 2018. This is joint work with Charu and Deepak. So to begin with, I'm going to start by an informal description of the linear assignment problem. So this problem instance has n tasks and n agents, and you have a constraint that only a single task can be assigned to a single agent. So you have to find a bijective mapping between agents and tasks. And there is a cost associated with assigning an agent to a task. So now the question is, can you find an agent task assignment where the total cost is minimized? So a bit more formally, this is just like you have two sets A and B of equal cardinality n, and then you have this particular constraint optimization problem that you have to solve, where C is the cost matrix and Cij is the cost of assigning the ith task to the jth agent. And then you have X, which is a permutation matrix that actually keeps track of the assignments, the actual assignments that you're making. And these constraints are nothing but saying that the permutation matrix should be a doubly stochastic matrix where you have the rows, each row adding up to 1 and each column adding up to 1. So this leads us to the quadratic assignment problem, which is one step further up, much harder than the linear assignment problem, where in the linear assignment problem, you had to assign points at a time, find the bijective mapping. Here you have to assign edges at a time. So imagine that you have a point set A and point set B and some sort of a graph structure imposed on each of these sides. So here in this problem, you have a set of facilities on the left side and locations on the other side. And your job is to find, is to set these facilities at these certain locations, place them at these locations. And you have a flow matrix associated with the flow between facilities, where that flow can be thought of as units of transfer between these facilities, and then you have a distance between the locations on the other side. So now the way to do it is that you want to have a way of assigning it in such a way that the locations that have a lot of business between them, where they have a lot of units of flow between them, you want them to be closer by in location as well. So this is formulated as the QAP in this Köppen-Beckmann form. I must say that there are several other forms, like a trace, example, a trace formulation, and there's some other formulations, equivalent formulations that you can solve in order to solve this QAP. Now notice that I have to now I have two permutation matrices, Xij, Xkl. The reason being that I now need to, if I had to do an edge-to-edge mapping, then I need to have the head of the edge mapping with the head of the edge there, and the tail of the edge mapping with the tail of the edge here. So this is quadratic because now I have two such permutation matrices. It has been shown that the QAP is NP-hard, and even an epsilon approximate solution of QAP has also been proven to be NP-hard. So then what do people resort to is something called linearization, which I will not be going into. But what it does is it introduces new variables, and you can imagine that earlier you had a permutation matrix that was a n square kind of matrix. Now you have an n to the power 4 kind of n square by n square matrix. And so you introduce a lot more variables in there, and then this can be solved as a linear assignment problem once you go from a quadratic to a linear. So in the area of computer vision, we have a matching problem where you're given two images, and you see there are certain landmark points that are marked on each of these images. And these landmark points are either detected by corner detection or edge detection algorithms, and then your job is to find the corresponding landmark point on the other image. And these images can be, as you can see, rotated, and you have different views of the same image, looking at them from different vantage points. So this actually is an instance of a graph matching problem. And here you can imagine that I can create some sort of a graph on the landmark points, which is either a k-nearest neighbor graph or a Delaunay triangulation. And then I'm trying to find a graph matching where I'm joining the edges. I'm finding assignments between the edges. So do a pairwise kind of assignment. Why do we bother solving this problem? Some of the applications are in this cryo-electron microscopy where you have 3D molecules, and I'm able to see just 2D images, 2D snapshots of them from various viewpoints, and then you have to then decide that these are just 2D images of the same molecule, okay, in structural biology. And so this assignment problem comes into handy there. And the same thing with protein structure comparisons, where you have these spiral kind of shapes, very complicated 3D structures, and then you have to align them. So in computer vision literature, this is sometimes called point set registration problem, where you have these points, and then you have to find the most optimal alignment to the other place. Structure from motion is another one where you have to do image stitching to get this video frame happening, where you see this car moving from one image to the other, and then you have to sort of stitch these together and say that these belong to a certain video sequence. In the jigsaw puzzle problem, you see these 3D pieces, and then you sort of piece these things together, put them together, and you reassemble and get a statue out of it. So this is another instance of assignment problem here. So it has several applications, but then there are some challenges with these existing methods. So these existing methods, they perform very poorly when you have occlusion. So for example, there can be cases where there are shadows on the images and some of the vertices are missing, some of the landmark points are missing, or you have rotated it in such a way that, one rotation, you are not able to see the left side, on the other, you can't see the right side. So certain rotations, certain things, and certain ways that you put it, you stretch some of these local geometric portions, and you start seeing a lot of stretching and sharing and stuff. So that makes it much harder to do this kind of a partial assignment where you have some of the information missing. The other thing we noticed was that the information in these higher order groupings was being ignored in the current methods, which we're doing graph matching, where we said that if we took the corner points, the 4 corner points of a window in a certain house on the left, that window should match with a window on the right side too. So we sort of wanted to have a more robust matching method. So what we resorted to was to come up with a simplicial complex instead of a graph, and then try, as you can see here, I'm matching triangles to triangles and edges to edges. And we also then introduced randomness into it because points can be missing completely at random. So we then built a random clique complex and then posed the problem of graph matching as now a higher order matching with this uncertainty included into it. So then we construct the way that we construct a random simplicial complex is that we just take these n vertices and we build a Erdos-Renyi graph on top of it. And for those of you not familiar how it's built, it's very simple. You take pairwise vertices and then you flip a coin and decide whether you want to have an edge between these vertices or not. Just a quick reminder that if you had k vertices and all of these had pairwise edges between them, then you form a complete subgraph, and that's a k-clique in a graph. So our random clique complex was nothing but just picking up these cliques and treating each clique as a simplex. So if you had a k+1 clique, that would be a k-simplex in our case. So, and that's how we built our random clique complex on top of our Erdős-Rényi graph that was being built. So then we wanted to also keep track of each case skeleton in there. So if you can imagine that you build this simplicial complex iteratively, where you start with the vertices and then add the edges and then add the triangles and so on and so forth. Each of these things was a skeleton, case skeleton, and we sort of kept track of these simplicial complexes at each of this level. And this becomes clear why we do that in the next sort of slide. So before we move on to that, what we had to do was we wanted to represent a case skeleton as an adjacency matrix. So what we did is that we looked at, we treated each case simplex in this random graph as a vertex set, and then you had an adjacency matrix, two vertices or simplices, case simplices were termed adjacent if they shared a common face with a minimum of L vertices. So you could imagine that if I had two triangles, I would call them adjacent if they shared a common edge between them, or even if they could share a common vertex between them, we would term them as adjacent. So this sort of gave us a good, nice flexibility when we could have, when we would term two cliques to be close to each other or not. And so we represented that as a matrix. And then our random simplicial complex was just a set of these matrices where k was the dimension of these simplices. So we did it at every dimension of the simplex. So then the constrained quadratic assignment problem, where we wanted to now match between two random simplicial complexes, just boil down to this particular constraint optimization problem, where we have we're trying to find an alignment between via these permutation matrices at each k-simplex level. So you have this set of k-simplices, and then you're sort of trying to match them, and this alignment between the graph G and G prime is achieved by doing the squared Frobenius norm and then summing them all over. So I'm not going to go through the details of the algorithm as such, but very quickly what would happen is that we would go in the reverse order of, like, we'll start with the highest dimensional simplices, try to match them. And then when you found a match, say, between the triangles, then when we move on to the lower dimensional simplex, like trying to match edges, we would say that we would constrain ourselves saying that these edges belong to a certain triangle, which is these triangles have already been matched. So take that into account when you're matching these edges. So that would keep on reducing the number of, the complexity would, of the matching would keep reducing all the time. And we use the standard Kuhn-Munkres algorithm to actually do the matching. Just very quickly, Lordenio et al. Showed that there's a spectral relaxation. This Loller's QAP is something that is a linearization of the QAP. I have not shown you what the Loller bound looks like, but then they had a closed form solution where they say that if you were to find the leading eigenvalue of the expression above, you actually solve the QAP. So what we did is that we thought of this affinity matrix, which is nothing but the n square by n square matrix that I was talking to you about, with the additional variables in there. We treat it as a random affinity matrix, and then we give these tight inequality, concentration inequality bounds on that. And so we have other theoretical material in the paper where we also talk about how the cliques are in a clique percolation, how that works, and stuff like that. So that was something that we added in the paper, but I'm not covering here. So some of the data sets that, so these are some of the linear transformations on, say, CMU house data set, which is a well-known data set. And you can see that we're doing some very simple linear transformations. But even here, you see that if you had to find matchings between the landmarks on, say, A and B, you know, it's not that easy to actually do it even on this. And then we had even more difficult data sets like these, where you have nonlinear transformations where the man is holding a magazine in front of him and is actually a video being recorded, and the person twists and turns it in all these different shapes to get these nonlinear kind of bends, and also would put his hand in between and occlude some of these portions of the book. Another difficult data set is that where you have two viewpoints of the same building, but then there's some portions that you can't assigned, so you have because they're completely missing from the one from the right. And then you had this books data set, which is well known. It is books being placed on an L-shaped table. And as you can see in these images, some of the books are missing. You're not able to see those paths, but the paths that you can see, you put landmark points on them and then try do an assignment there. So some of the so what we tried was that we took the CMU house data set, for example, and we on the left side you see that we take 40% of the images and then completely at random keep dropping points, landmark points in there, and then we see that as we increase from say 10% of the points being dropped to 30% and stuff, the red line at the bottom is our method, and we see that it doesn't change much. The error percentage in accuracy stays the same, whereas the other methods, the error keeps getting higher and higher, so they do worse in terms of matching. And we see the same in when we do that on 60% of the images and we start dropping these points. We notice that there is a slight bump in our errors, but the other ones just, they get really drastic by the time they reach to say 25% to 30% of the points are missing. Then we just show some nonlinear transformations, occlusions, and in these more difficult data sets, like I showed you with the magazine and books and stuff, we find that our errors are very low compared to the existing methods. One thing I would like to point out is that FGM, which is the factorized graph matching, which is that dotted pink line at the bottom, was a close second. So that is a pretty good method as well, if one were to consider it. Here in this case, we find that people who are the methods that actually don't take into account higher order information and this randomness in the points in these occlusions, they suffer and they incur a lot of error in their methods. So this brings me to the end of my talk. I would like to thank all of you. And I look forward to seeing you at the session where we can have a live discussion about the things that I've shown you here. Thank you all.
Hello, I'm Yasu Hiraoka from Kyoto. Today, I'm going to talk about rare events appearing in persistent homology. Before starting the talk, I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop for giving me an opportunity of this talk. Let me first explain the motivation why I am interested in rare events in persistent homology. I have been recently working on materials TDA, and these are some examples to which I have applied TDA so far. Through these researches, we found that persistent homology is a really powerful tool to characterize hierarchical structures in complex materials. However, in these applications, there are several or many opportunities where we actually need multi-parameter persistent homology for more detailed characterizations of material structures. Since the full version of the multi-parameter persistent homology is still difficult to handle, we have developed a restricted version of the two-parameter persistent homology called commutative ladder persistence. Namely, this is a representation defined over A2 tensor AN algebra, where AN means linear quiver. Here I'm showing an example of A2 tensor A3 case, and in this setting, the persistence diagram is defined by a function on the vertex set of the Auslander-Leiten quiver shown in the right. In the Auslander-Leiten quiver, each vertex corresponds to an indecomposable expressed by its dimension vector. Here we note that the red vertices correspond to non-interval indecomposables, and all the others are intervals in the two-parameter sense. For details, please see the paper written with Emerson Escala in 2016. Then we applied it to some problems defined over random point processes in a Euclidean space and observed interesting phenomena. Namely, non-interval indecomposables rarely appeared. We have tested several times, but roughly speaking, zero or only one generator of non-interval appeared out of 10,000 total generators. So these numerical experiments may imply the following question. Under random effect in the Euclidean space, do non-intervals rarely appear in multi-parameter persistent homology? This is the main motivation of my recent mathematical works. And to this question, my approach is to combine the probability theory, especially random topology, and representation theory. And today I'll talk about several aspects relating to this question. Here are the contents of my talk. Before starting the two-parameter setting, I need to build a necessary framework in one-parameter case. In section 1, I will briefly review my previous work on limit theorems of persistence diagrams in one-parameter case. Then, I will show our recent results about the large deviation principle in one-parameter persistence diagrams. Here, roughly speaking, large deviation principles enable us to study rare events of random variables. And finally, I will show some ongoing works on the law of large numbers for two-parameter persistent homology, which tell us a partial answer to the above question. So this is the content of my talk. All right. Well, let's start section 1. Here, I'd like to review several previous results about limit theorems in persistent homology. And for the sake of simplicity, I focus on the cubical setting today, like this. Let me first explain our setting. I will study cubical sets constructed by elementary cubes in d-dimensional space. Here, an elementary cube is defined by a product of d intervals with unit length or length 0 on the integer lattice. We denote by kd the set of all elementary cubes in Rd. Then our configuration space, big omega, is given by the product space of the unit interval over all elementary cubes. And so each configuration, small omega, is defined by assigning a value from 0 to 1 on each elementary cube, like this right figure shows. Then we assign a probability measure on this configuration space, and today we simply consider a product measure. Under this preparation, our random cubical set is given for each omega and time t as a collection of all elementary cubes whose assigned values are less than or equal to t. Of course, the randomness on omega will induce the randomness on this cubical set. And from this definition, the random cubical set xt will be an infinite set, and so we will introduce a finite cubical set by restricting the original cubical set into the window lambda n with length to n, like this figure. So restricting our attention into this window, finite window. Furthermore, by changing the threshold time t, we naturally get the random filtration of cubical set. On this setting, first we can show the law of large numbers for Betti numbers. Let beta nq is the qth Betti number of the restricted cubical set by the window at time t. Here, let me recall that n means the length of the window for the restriction. Then, for each t and q, there exists a non-random constant beta hat such that the restricted Betti number normalized by the volume of the window converges to this constant as n goes to infinity almost surely. Namely, this theorem clarifies the averaging behavior of the Betti numbers and also shows that the volume of the window is the appropriate scaling factor to observe this limiting behavior. This is a law of large numbers. In today's talk, I will not use the following results, but for reference, I just show that the central limit theorem also holds in this setting. Next, by combining this result with random measure theory, we can generalize it into the law of large numbers for persistence diagrams. we can generalize it into the law of large numbers for persistence diagrams. First of all, I regard a persistence diagram as a counting measure defined over the triangular region delta. And since we are dealing with a random filtration, our persistence diagram will be a random variable. And this implies that the persistence diagram can be regarded as a point process on delta. I use this convention in my talk, and let C be the point process on delta corresponding to the Q's persistence diagram of the random filtration Xn restricted by the window. Then there exists a unique random measure nu on delta such that the restricted persistence diagrams normalized by volume of the window converges to this random measure as n, so length of the window goes to infinity almost surely. So this theorem shows the averaging behavior of the persistence diagrams with the volume as its scaling factor. Here is a sketch of the proof. The first item is already explained. Second, we extend the law of large number into the persistent Bethe numbers, and also generalize it into multiplicities on rectangular regions by taking alternating sums shown in the right figure. Then, at this moment, we obtain an assignment of a value for each rectangular region on delta. And by applying random measure theory, we explicitly construct a measure corresponding to nu in the theorem. So this is a sketch of the proof. Now let us move on to our recent results about the large deviation principles. This is a joint work with Kanazawa, Miyanaga, and Tsunoda. Under the same setting so far, we can show that the persistent Bethe numbers satisfy the large deviation principle with the following rate function I. Well, the rate function I looks complicated, but of course you don't need to remember it. There are several remarks. First, now three fundamental theorems in probability theory, namely law of large number, central limit theorem, and large deviation principle are completed, and as a result, various limiting behaviors can be now discussed. In particular, by using this result, we can study rare events away from the average from this estimate. And as a final remark, we can generalize this result into the multiplicities on rectangles in delta as before, so by taking the alternating sum of the persistent Bethe numbers. Then, as before, we can generalize this result on the setting of persistence diagrams. This is the main result of my talk today. Namely, the normalized persistence diagrams satisfy the large deviation principle with a rate function h defined by this. Before going into the detail, I'd like to emphasize here that we can study rare events characterized by persistence diagram from this result. Here, Psi is a bijection between a projective limit space of rectangular measures and the set of finite Borel measures. And J is a rate function defined over this projective limit space. So let me explain about the projective limit, this projective limit appearing in the statement in more detail. Here, for each L, we consider a grid decomposition on delta with length 1/2 to the L, like this. Then let BL be a finite dimensional vector space spanned by Lebesgue measures on these grids. Furthermore, from L+1 to L, we define a linear map by this, namely flattening the measure on the pink grid to that on the green containing the pink grid. Then we can easily see that this sequence defines a projective limit. Now I can explain a sketch of the proof for the LDP of persistence diagrams. First, we show LDP for each BL by applying LDP for rectangles. Then the LDP for each BL can be lifted to the LDP for the projective limit by applying the Dawson-Gartner theorem. However, this projective limit space is too large comparing to the radon measure, which was obtained as the limiting object of the law of large number for persistence diagrams. Therefore, by restricting the project limit space to B infinity plus, which is defined in the statement of the theorem here, B infinity plus, this is a subspace of the projective limit space with a certain condition. So by restricting the projective limit space to B infinity plus, we can induce LDP to our suitable space of measures on delta. So this is a sketch of the proof for LDP of persistence diagrams. Alright, so this is the final slide on my talk, and let me briefly explain on an ongoing work with Shimizu. Here I go back to the original motivation explained at the beginning of my talk. As I mentioned, some computational experiments about commutative ladder persistence based on random point processes implied that non-interval indecomposables rarely appeared. I'm interested in this phenomena, and we obtained the following results so far. First, we can show the law of large number for each indecomposables in this setting. Here, di means the multiplicity of the indecomposable I appearing in the given representation. This can be done by almost similar arguments explained today. But I'd like to emphasize that we can also show this. Namely, limiting multiplicities for non-intervals will vanish in subcritical regime. At this moment, I cannot remove the assumption of subcriticality on the point process, but this result positively explains the previous numerical observations. And conversely speaking, it implies the significance of the concept of interval decompositions even in the two-parameter setting. I need to remark that these results depend on our geometric setting given by point clouds in the Euclidean space. And of course, I'm not saying a similar statement for any representations of multi-parameter persistence in purely algebraic sense. I'm not saying so. However, this result suggests that under suitable geometric settings, the algebraic structure may be simplified, and the interval decompositions may be one candidate even in multi-parameter setting. Alright, so this is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this very interesting workshop. The title of my talk today is Topological Abstractions in Gradient-Based Learning. It is based on joint works with Grigory Sotnikov, Alexander Korotin, Dmitry Aganesian, Ilya Trofimov, Daniil Yemtsov, and Evgeny Burnaev. Let's start. Mathematically, if one opens the black box of deep learning, there are two main immediate mysteries. First, the algorithms based on gradient descent achieve almost zero loss with deep neural networks, although the loss functions of deep neural networks are non-convex. Second, there is almost no overfitting, despite the fact that the number of parameters is much bigger than the number of data points. To gain insights into these mysteries, I propose to apply methods of topological data analysis to loss functions. Let us look at topological abstractions in gradient descent. Loss functions of neural networks are non-convex, have multiple minima, saddles which are also degenerate. Local minima, saddles, and flat regions in vicinities of such points are obstacles for gradient-based optimization. These obstacles are topological by nature as any other critical sets. Here on the left picture, we see a gradient-based trajectory which is trapped on a local minimum, and it has difficulty to go to global minimum. On the right picture, the gradient-based trajectory is trapped in a flat region near a saddle, and it has also some difficulty to escape from this region. The barcodes, which I will introduce in a minute, are the numerical invariants that can distinguish how bad are the topological obstacles in gradient-based optimization. In ideal situation, if a function on a domain has a single minimum and no other critical points, and also the gradient of the function is pointing outside of the domain, then all gradient-based trajectories converge to the single minimum. I define topological abstraction score as the distance between two barcodes, the barcode of the loss function L and the barcode of such ideal function with single minimum at the same level as the global minimum of loss function L. How to define barcodes? Usually, the quality of local minimum is measured via the Hessian, but this is often unsatisfactory. Clearly, some minima can harm more than others the gradient-based learning, even if locally they look the same. For example, here on the right picture, the local minimum is certainly more difficult to escape for a gradient-based trajectory than the local minimum on the left picture. Definition of the barcode. To quantify the badness of a local minimum, let us measure the following high loss penalty. Namely, to pass to a point with lower loss, a path starting at a given local minimum P has to climb up to points with higher loss. The minimal value of this higher loss penalty on paths to lower loss points is the topological invariant of the given local minimum. For example, here in the right picture, we see that a gradient-based trajectory has to climb higher, starting from a given local minimum P. In order to pass to points with loss which are lower than the value of the loss at the minimum P. With local minimum P, we associate the line segment, which measures such difficulty. The left end of the line segment is given by the value of the loss at the minimum, and the right end of the line segment is given by this high loss penalty. The barcode of the function L is the disjoint union of such segments for all local minima, plus half line accounting for the global minimum. Like here, for example, we have a function with 3 local minimum, and the barcode corresponding to this function consists of half line accounting for the global minimum and 3 segments, 1 segment for each local minimum. The bigger the length of minimum segment, the more difficulty the given local minimum represents for gradient-based trajectories. Gradient-based optimization trajectory trapped in vicinity of this local minimum P has bigger difficulty to escape it and reach lower loss values. In order to compute these barcodes of minima in case of simple neural networks, we propose the following algorithm A. It is based on evolution of connected components of sublevel sets of the function L. Namely, we build approximation of loss surface by finite graph-based construction. By sampling subsets of points in the domain theta and connecting points within H if they're close. Assuming points theta I are ordered with respect to the value of the function L, we look at the evolution on connected components of constructed graph by sequential adding the vertices theta 1, theta n, starting from an empty graph. When we add a new vertex theta n plus 1, there are 3 possibilities for connected components of the graph constructed from the points theta 1, theta n plus 1. Namely, the vertex theta n plus 1 may have 0 degree in the constructed graph from the points theta 1, theta n plus 1. This means that theta n plus 1 is a new local minimum of L, and it forms a new connected component in the sublevel set. Second possibility, all the neighbors of theta n plus 1 in the graph constructed from point theta 1, theta n plus 1 belong to the same connected component of the graph constructed from the points theta 1, theta n. This means that there is no change in the connected components, and we can pass to adding the next point. Third possibility, all the neighbors of theta n plus 1 in the graph constructed from theta 1, theta n plus 1 belong to at least two different connected components. Therefore, these connected components will form a single connected component after adding this point theta n plus 1. The lowest minimum connected component sk swallows all the rest. And for the connected components which are swallowed, this defines the barcode. The line segment is by definition given by the following ends. Left end is the minimum of L on this connected component, and the right end is the value of L at this point theta n plus 1. And then we pass to adding the next point. The barcode calculated by this algorithm converges to the barcode of L as we increase the total number of sampled points for any Lipschitz function L. We applied this algorithm in the case of simple neural networks, namely fully connected with one hidden layer, two hidden layer, and three hidden layers. One hidden layer with 2 and 3 neurons, two hidden layers with 2, 2, 3, 2, and 3 and 3 neurons, and three hidden layers with 2, 2, 2, and 3, 2, and 2 neurons. The loss function is mean squared error for predicting certain randomly chosen function g, plus L2 regularization. Here are the results. In each picture, we see a collection of segments. Each segment corresponds to a local minimum of the function of loss on this neural network. The lower value of the segment corresponds to the value of L at this minima, and the higher end of the segment corresponds to the minimal loss penalty to go from this local minimum to a lower loss points. We see the pattern that as we increase the depth of the neural network, the segments descend lower and they become smaller. Observations is that the barcodes are located in the tiny lower part of the range of the values. Typically, the maximum value of the function is around 200 and higher, and the segments lie below 1 and lower. And main observation is that with increase of the neural network depth and width, the barcodes descend lower, and topological abstraction score diminishes. Of course, this algorithm A cannot be applied in the case of deep neural networks. In the case of deep neural networks, to estimate the barcodes, we propose the following algorithm B. It is based on the above definition, which is summarized in this formula. So here we minimize over all paths starting from the point P and going to points with lower loss. We minimize the maximal value on this path. To apply this algorithm, we do the following. We apply gradient descent to paths which start from the given minimum P and end at lower value points. The minima are sampled using gradient descent from randomly chosen starting points. Then after optimization applied to this path, for each minimum P, we calculate the loss penalty by this formula. This computation gives a stochastic estimate for expected barcode of loss. Here are the results for the fully connected networks. We took the fully connected networks with 2 layers and 64 neurons in each layer. Then 3 layers, also with 64 neurons, 4 layers, 6 and 8 layers, all with 64 neurons in each hidden layer. And we observe that the barcodes descend lower as in the case in which we computed on the simple neural networks. We have also computed, using the algorithm B, the barcodes for convolutional neural networks on the CIFAR10 dataset. Here also we see the pattern that as we increase depth and width of the neural network, the barcodes descend lower. The pattern of barcodes descending lower with increase of depth and width is clearly seen both for fully connected deep neural networks and for convolutional neural networks on various datasets, MNIST, Fashion MNIST, CIFAR10. The algorithm B can be applied for calculation of index R barcodes using gradient descent action on R simplices. The index R barcode corresponds to index R saddles. Experiments with these barcodes show the same outcome of barcodes descending lower with increase of depth and width of the neural networks. Connection between barcodes height and generalization. Neural networks trained with constant small learning rate have less test accuracy compared to ones trained with higher learning rate being annealed during the training process. This is known fact, and we use it to estimate the dependence between barcodes height and accuracy. We have analyzed the loss function for both types of this minima. We took ResNet neural networks and trained on CIFAR10 in two scenarios, using a constant small learning rate and applying annealing of learning rate. We have obtained two groups of minima with similar, nearly zero values of loss function on the training set. However, their test accuracy differed significantly. On the first type of minima, we had 67.4 accuracy. On the second type of minima, 75.7 accuracy, thus giving huge generalization gap for the first type of minima compared with the second type of minima. Very interestingly, we observed that the segments of minima of the first type in the barcode are always higher than the segments for the second type of minima. To prove this result, we have also completed the same procedure for the SVHN dataset and get the same outcome. Here are the results. We see that second type of minima, which have better accuracy, also have much lower barcodes. We observed that the generalization ability is superior for minima with lower barcodes. Conclusions. The barcodes give mathematical framework for studying mean loss landscapes. The barcodes and the topological abstraction score provide numerical factorization for badness of loss landscapes in gradient-based learning. The pattern of barcodes diminishing and descending lower with increase of neural networks depth and width is found in the context of simple neural networks and confirmed on deep neural networks on various datasets, MNIST, Fashion MNIST, CIFAR10. We have also found intriguing connection between the length of segments in barcodes and generalization ability of different types of minima in deep neural networks. Thank you for your attention.
I'm going to talk about the representation theory of filtered hierarchical clustering and presenting joint work with Magnus Botnan, Steffen Oppermann, and Johann Steen. So the question here, the motivation is to study clusters in point clouds, if you want. And here you see two literal clouds, and blue and green, and you see a little bit of red fog in the background. And you can tell already from this picture, it's not quite easy to make precise where exactly the cloud ends and where the fog begins, and how the two different clouds come about if you don't have the coloring and this partition that's indicated in colors here given already. So to formalize the problem of clustering, we speak about clustering functions. This is formalism introduced by Kleinberg. So we have a finite set X, and by clustering function we mean a function that maps a metric on the set X. So this is a distance matrix to a partition of that underlying set. Now, Kleinberg identified three properties that are desirable for clustering functions. The first one is scale invariance, saying that whenever I scale the entire metric by a constant scalar multiple, lambda, then the clustering itself should not be affected by that. Second one is richness. Any possible partition of the set X should arise from some metric. And the third one is consistency. If I decrease distances within the clusters, and at the same time I only increase distances across clusters, then this should not change the final result of the clustering method either. Kleinberg then went on to show that while these three axioms are very reasonable, it's impossible to satisfy all of them at the same time. So this is his famous result. No clustering function satisfies scale invariance, richness, and consistency. This result here, showing that in a sense the question is ill-posed, motivates to not just ask for a single clustering that's associated to a metric space, but instead to a one-parameter family that assigns a fixed clustering to any chosen length scale, to any geometric scale. And that leads to the idea of hierarchical clustering. The simplest example is single linkage clustering. I can quickly illustrate it here. We can work with a proximity graph. So this is the subgraph of the complete graph on X, where we filter the edges by their proximity, by their pairwise distance. So now we can consider the connected components of this geometric graph, and this gives us a partition. And considering the connection to persistent homology, the zeroth persistent homology with coefficients in some field k is actually obtained from the connected components by constructing the free vector space generated by that set of connected components. So this gives us a diagram of vector spaces indexed over the parameter. Now, there's a positive result complementing the negative result by Kleinberg for hierarchical clustering, namely the single linkage clustering method we have just seen is actually the unique method that satisfies certain axioms similar to the axioms by Kleinberg. However, there's a caveat here. The single linkage clustering is actually not used much in practice because it's very sensitive to outliers. So in this example, you would see here, even though these two clouds on the left and on the right are clearly separated in some sense, the outliers coming from the fog in the background, in a sense, create a chain, if you want, of short edges that connect the two clusters very quickly, and that kind of leads to the breakdown of the single linkage clustering method very quickly. And that's the reason why this method is not used much in practice. What's used instead is typically methods that invoke a second parameter in addition to proximity. That's some kind of density parameter. So the setup would be here to filter the points by an estimated densities, and then only after that to filter the edges by proximity. So this leads us to two-parameter clustering, and the situation we have is very similar to before. We studied geometric graphs, and we look at connected components, and then again we can also pass to vector spaces by considering the corresponding zeroth homology. We get a diagram of vector spaces, and that leads us to the world of representation theory, which is concerned with the study of such diagrams of vector spaces and with the decomposition of such diagrams into smaller and eventually into indecomposable elementary building blocks. The decomposition is something very familiar in the situation where you just have given a single map, and then this is basically the rank nullity theorem, which can be expressed as follows. Any linear map F decomposes as a direct sum of a linear map which basically consists only of the kernel to the left, then a linear map which identifies the image in the domain with the codomain, and then another summand which consists basically only of the kernel in a co-kernel in the codomain. So this is all very familiar. As it turns out, the same thing also works if you compose two different linear maps. You also get this kind of decomposition into simple building blocks. You see that the building blocks are always basically copies of your field, and they span a certain interval here. And this extends actually to any finite sequence of linear maps, and any such diagram decomposes into summands that are supported like one-dimensional vector spaces across a certain interval.
And the collection of those intervals is precisely the familiar persistence barcode. This is the reason why persistence is able to describe, for example, the persistence of homology so well, because it really expresses the entire structure, the entire decomposition of such a diagram in a very concise form. The fact that this is possible in this situation is kind of a rare coincidence in the world of general diagrams of vector spaces, and there's a famous result by Frost from the 70s that classifies the possible situations that can occur. The first one is, like the one we have seen, we have a finite list of possible indecomposable diagrams of a given shape. That's kind of the best case. There's also a still very good case, which is called tame. We have a finite list of one parameter families of indecomposables. The parameter runs over the field, the base field of our vector spaces. And then the third situation is already as complicated as modules over any finite dimensional algebra. So this is actually in particular a theory that includes undecidable problems. And another thing to note is that instead of having one parameter families of indecomposables, here we have indecomposables involving infinitely many parameters. So the situation can become very bad very quickly. In fact, if for the diagrams that we're interested in, which are this kind of grid shape, there's another theorem that classifies those diagrams by the number of squares appearing in these grids. And as a matter of fact, if we have less than 4 squares in the diagram, then the diagram is finite type. If we have exactly 4, it's tame, and if we have more, then it's wild type. So that's happening very quickly. In particular, if we have 2 rows of vector spaces in one parameter direction and too many columns in the other direction, then we're already in the situation of wild type, where we can't play this game of barcodes anymore. So let's go back to the motivating example and consider 2-parameter clustering, and just think about what type of diagrams arise there. And here one other important property shows up if we look at the situation more closely, namely that the maps in the horizontal direction, the maps arising from the proximity parameter, are not just arbitrary maps, but they're all surjective linear maps. So that's simply because as we increase the proximity parameter, clusters only merge, but no new clusters appear just by changing the proximity parameter. So that means we have this particular class of diagrams where all the horizontal maps are surjective. And our initial idea was maybe this helps because at least let's look at a simple example. We look at diagrams of the shape 2 by n, and then you can actually prove by elementary means that this gives us finite type classification. We have a finite number of indecomposables. Here's a small example for a running example, decomposing into 3 indecomposables, which are really behave a lot like barcodes. They're kind of L shapes. But with using a lot of heavy machinery then from representation theory to study the general result, we arrived at this main result of our paper, which classifies the representation types of grids with restrictions, epimorphism restrictions in no or 1 or 2 parameter directions. And well, this result basically says that the representation type, if you have a epimorphism restriction in 1 parameter direction, is the same as the representation type of the general grid without restrictions on the maps for 1 parameter less in the other direction, as you can see here. So in particular, for the situation we're interested in, where all the horizontal maps are surjections, we have to remove 1 row from the diagram and then count the remaining number of squares. And again, if that number is less than 4, we're finite type. If it's tame, if it's equal to 4, we're tame, and if it's more than 4, we're wild type. What's behind the scenes here, just to give you a little bit of insight, is that there's an equivalence of categories. On the left-hand side, we form an additive quotient of these diagrams with horizontal epimorphisms. And basically what we're modding out here is the class of diagrams that have epimorphisms horizontally and monomorphisms vertically. And as it turns out, this particular class is actually finite type, and the indecomposables are of the type that you see here on the bottom right. And now if you form this additive quotient, which means that you identify morphisms in the class below whose difference in the class above whose difference factors through an object of the class below, then this quotient category is equivalent to the representations where you decrease the number of rows by 1. Let me just point out another important aspect here, the question about which of such diagrams are actually realizable by some clustering scenario. The motivation is that there's a result by Carson and Somarodian saying that any m by n diagram of vector spaces over the field with 2 elements here in this case can be realized as the p homology of a diagram of topological spaces for any p greater than 0. Of course, now we're interested in the case homology in degree equal to 0. So what about this case? And as a matter of fact, the situation is different here, and we have an explicit counterexample showing that not every representation consisting of just epimorphisms in both directions even can be realized as homology or reduced homology even in degree 0. And we strengthen this by showing this is not even, the counterexample can't even occur as a summand of something larger, something more complicated. So this is really a strong contrast in anything can happen in higher homology, but somehow in homology in degree 0, the situation is limited and not everything can occur. Just an important point to point out is that these indecomposables that we try to build are not the same as clusters. We should rather think of them as linear combinations of clusters. And while they are still topological features that help to survey the parameter space, if we look at this example here with the 2 clouds connected by some thin line, then we get 2 significant indecomposables with a large support and then many small ones. And in a sense, the first the motivation is that there's a result by Carson and Somarodian saying that any m by n diagram of vector spaces over the field with 2 elements here in this case can be realized as the p homology of a diagram of topological spaces for any p greater than 0. Of course, now we're interested in the case homology in degree equal to 0. So what about this case? And as a matter of fact, the situation is different here. And we have an explicit counterexample showing that not every representation consisting of just epimorphisms in both directions even can be realized as homology or reduced homology even in degree 0. And we strengthen this by showing this is not even the counterexample can't even occur as a summand of something larger, something more complicated. So this is really a strong contrast in anything can happen in higher homology, but somehow in homology in degree 0, the situation is limited and not everything can occur. An important point to point out is that these intercomposables that we try to build are not the same as clusters. We should rather think of them as linear combinations of clusters. And while they are still topological features that help to survey the parameter space, if we look at this example here with the two clouds connected by some thin line, then we get two significant indecomposables with a large support and then many small ones. And in a sense, the first significant component is the entire thing, and then the second one is maybe the difference between the two. So we're kind of using a linear algebra here to put a basis that's maybe different from the standard one that generated by single components only. There's still a lot of challenges here, for of course, how to efficiently compute the indecomposables. There are generic algorithms that are rather slow in practice. The classifications of representations that actually arise from clustering, and also inference problems. Well, here's the reference for the paper, and here's some funding provided by the German and Norwegian funding agencies. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to our Spotlight presentation. I am Adrish Dey, and today I'll be presenting our work, Topo Sampler, a topology constant noise sampling for GANs. This is a joint work with my collaborator, Sayantan Das. In this work, we examine the problem of disconnected manifold learning in generative adversarial networks from a topological perspective. This is an ongoing study, and thus we share our results from early stage findings. Since its inception in 2014, GANs has been the most commonly used and widely studied generative model. Despite their capability of producing extremely realistic samples, GANs sometimes produce samples which tends to look like an unrealistic interpolation between samples of different classes. This happens because GANs trained using unimanifolded prior, like isotropic Gaussian, learns a globally connected cover with no d-dimensional holes, completely ignoring the ones that might be present on the original data manifold. Researchers have introduced several novel approaches for dealing with this problem. Some of the notable work in this area are mentioned on this slide. In our work, we propose a novel topological perspective for studying this problem and experiment on a two-part method for approaching it. For the first part, we study the effect of regularization on the prior space, making it topologically similar to the data space. For this purpose, we minimize the topological signature loss borrowed from Moore et al.'s work on topological autoencoders. Our aspiration lies in training a neural network capable of transporting unimanifolded prior samples to a learned space having similar topological features to that of the data space. In the second part, we enforce homeomorphic guarantees by one Lipschitz constraining the learnable layers and the activation functions. We experiment on various architectures, including low-dimensional homeomorphism, followed by dimensionality jump, as shown on top right, and globally homeomorphic networks, as shown on bottom right. Here's the entire experimental architecture of our work. The experiment as of now are far from complete. However, we did find some interesting results. For example, we noticed that the visual quality of sample drops with the increase in dimension of the prior. We also found that the Lipschitz constraining the generator makes it nearly impossible to reach an equilibrium, as shown in the animation. On the topological side, we found that the proposed noise module is not being able to introduce d-dimensional holes in the prior manifold. Instead, it stretches the manifold to increase the sample density near the distributions and reducing it elsewhere. We suspect that this might be caused by the innate continuous nature of neural networks. We found empirical evidence that the disconnected prior produces completely disconnected posteriors with no out-of-manifold samples, as shown on top right, which is not in the case of unimanifold priors, as shown on bottom right. This reinforces the homeomorphic guarantees we established before. In conclusion, we propose a topological perspective of viewing disconnected manifold learning in GANs. We show empirical evidence on the importance of prior space topology on disconnected manifold learning. We propose a systemic approach for enforcing topological constants on the prior to aid disconnected manifold learning. We empirically prove the homeomorphic guarantees of Lipschitz constraint generator. Thank you for your patience. Please refer to the paper for more information And feel free to drop by if you have any follow-up questions.
Hi, I'm Eric Bunch, and I'm part of a machine learning research group at American Family Insurance. I'm going to give a brief overview of the work my co-authors and I have done for this paper. The other authors on this paper are Daniel Dickinson, Jeffrey Klein, and Glenn Fung. Please visit our website to learn more about us. The magnitude of a metric space was first introduced in a biology paper as a way to measure the effective number of species in an ecosystem. It was later rediscovered by Thomas Leinster and cast into the framework of category theory. Since then, it has grown in popularity and has been shown to have connections to functional analysis, geometry, and persistent homology. Although magnitude can be defined for a much larger family of objects, we restrict ourselves to the setting of a finite set X in Euclidean space. Define the similarity matrix zeta X to have ijth entry equal to e to the negative distance between xi and xj. The weighting vector is then defined to be zeta X inverse multiplied by the column vector of all ones. In this setting, zeta X is positive definite, so its inverse exists. Magnitude is then defined as the sum of all the entries in zeta X inverse. When the weighting vector is viewed as a function from the data set to the real line, it can surprisingly be used as an effective boundary detector. In the plot shown, the value of the weighting vector assigns to a point is represented by both the size and the color of that point. We see that the interior points in the set have low weight and the points on the boundary have high weight. For the purposes of this presentation, we take these pictures to be proof enough of this claim, but please see Appendix B in our paper for the further discussion. Once we have an effective boundary detector in hand, we can define a number of machine learning algorithms. Here we have pictures representing 3 machine learning algorithms based on the weighting vector. The classification algorithm is defined by finding the weight of an unlabeled point with respect to each individual class. The class for which this new point has the smallest weight is the predicted class for that point. We can define an outlier detection algorithm by looking for points that change the magnitude of a set the most if they are removed from that set. And finally, we define a sampling algorithm for active learning by looking at the difference between weighting vectors on the entire data set and those of individual classes. So in conclusion, the weighting vector is an effective boundary detector, and we have used it to construct machine learning algorithms. For future work on this topic, we continue to explore applications as well as approximation mechanisms for large data sets and settings where data points do not belong to Euclidean space. Please check out our workshop paper as well as our archive paper and our GitHub repo, and feel free to email me at ebunch@amfam.com with further questions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Davies from the University of Southampton, and along with Nick Bishop, I am the first author of this paper, which is also written with Longtran Tanch from the The purpose of this work was to provide a statistical learning theoretic justification for integrating topological knowledge into the loss terms. So when you integrate a topological loss term, so when you integrate a persistence diagram into a topological loss term, essentially what you're doing is encouraging or restricting the hypothesis class, which is just the space of functions that we're learning in, to functions which have a specific topology. So the purpose of this paper is to study this hypothesis class through the lens of statistical learning theory. So a very common way to study hypothesis classes in statistical learning theory is to see if this hypothesis class is non-uniformly learnable. So essentially what you're doing when you're checking if a hypothesis class is non-uniformly learnable is you're seeing if there exists some algorithm for which you can lower bound the number of points you need to sample to learn a probably approximately correct function. So this just means that given some error bound and some confidence bound, you can learn a function from the class which is probably, so within some confidence bound, correct, so within some error bound. So what we did was show that the hypothesis class that you get when you restrict in this way is in fact non-uniformly learnable. So we used some work by Justin Curry on the fiber of the persistence map to prove this theorem, which is our main result, that the hypothesis class is non-uniformly learnable when you restrict it in this way. So this provides what we believe is the first learning theoretic justification for the integration of persistence-based summaries into loss functions for deep learning in this way. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to talk about this really cool project we have at Michigan State University, quantifying barley morphology using Euler characteristic curves, which is a project that mixes math, computer science, image processing, and plant biology. And when I say plant biology, I mean barley. You may not be aware of, but barley is the fourth most cultivated grain in the world. And not just that, it's extremely versatile, it's extremely diverse. It can grow in the Arctic circles in Norway, in Russia, in the Urals, near the desert in Morocco, Iraq, Ethiopia, India, all over the place. And this this diversity in different climates and altitudes and growing conditions translates into a diversity in shapes, a morphological diversity that we can even look at it in seeds. So for instance, here in Scotland, the seeds are kind of narrow and elongated. Seeds in the Tibet, they are very small and round. And then you have a huge diversity of seeds with every climate in between. And when you ask about shape, we say DA. So if I had to summarize my whole research in just one single slide, this would be it. We have raw data, which are X-ray CT scans, very, very high detail voxel-based images of barley panicles. Then we digitally managed to extract all the seeds from each of these panicles, and just with the seeds we can ask about length, volume, surface area, but we can do more. We can do Euler characteristic curves, which is fix a direction, and for each sublevel sets across that direction, we can track how the Euler characteristic changes, and then do the same idea for multiple directions. That's the Euler characteristic transform, a time series of how Euler characteristic changes. And this means that we get out of the seed, we get a nice little vector that we then can plug into a basic statistical or machine learning framework. And to see that actually this workflow makes some sense, we tried to classify 28 different lines, 28 different varieties of barley corresponding to 28 very diverse climates across the Eurasian continent. And we got actually very exciting results. So if we just use traditional descriptors, like I mentioned, length, surface area, volume, 11 descriptors in total, we get an accuracy of about 53%. But if we take our Euler characteristic transform, we reduce it to 12 dimensions, and we combine those 12 dimensions with the 11 traditional descriptors, our accuracy suddenly goes all the way up to 70%. So topology is actually measuring something. And you are more than welcome to come and see my animated poster for more details.
Hello, my name is Guillaume Tozin, and I've come to speak on behalf of all these nice people about Joto TDA, an open source Python library developed at EPFL Red L2F and Innate with the support of InnoSwiss. The goal of this library is to make the fruitful and active interplay between topological data analysis and machine learning, attested to beautifully by this NEURLIPS workshop, even smoother. Coming from either of these fields, it is not trivial to develop the competencies needed to create and research in their intersection. We believe that code that is thoroughly documented, easy to install, easy to use, and fast is key, and with Joto TDA we set out to do just that. This package combines the unique power of TDA with the flexibility and maturity of the scikit-learn framework for modern machine learning in Python. This also makes Joto TDA easy to extend and to integrate within existing machine learning pipeline. Joto TDA has two main capabilities, persistent homology and mapper. Let me tell you about the first. Many input data types are supported, graphs, images, point clouds, and even time series, making available many preprocessing tools for them. We also have a rich selection of Joto TDA also implements the mapper algorithm as a single scikit-learn pipeline. As a result, various steps of the estimator can be arbitrary scikit-learn estimators, and mapper can also become part of a larger custom pipeline for supervised or unsupervised machine learning tasks. There are also plotting functionalities with real-time interactivity designed for fast data exploration. But let me give you an example to showcase the ease of use of a Joto TDA persistent homology pipeline. Say you have a collection of point clouds. Some are sampled from spheres, some are sampled from Tori, all with noise, and we want to classify them. As it is common in machine learning, we start to separate our data between the train set and the test set. We can generate a persistent diagram from each point cloud using our virtual persistent transformer. Then from those persistent diagrams, we can extract a simple feature, say the persistent entropy. From that point on, we have associated a few features to each point cloud, and we can use them to train a random forest classifier. All these steps can be combined using a scikit-learn pipeline. Then a single fit is required, and we can evaluate our model on the test set. So, why use Joto TDA? Because it's easy, powerful, and versatile. There are plenty of resources to learn to use it. Furthermore, it's constantly growing thanks to your input and contributions, and to the work of a committed and responsive core development team. Feel free to join our demo sessions or to reach us directly. And with that said, I thank you for your presence and attention.